On the night of July 24th, 1943, a young German radar operator named Emil Kappel leaned over his Freya console just outside Hamburg, watching the green phosphor glow of the screen pulse in the darkness. This was a normal night shift: cold coffee, buzzing equipment, the quiet hum of the bunker. Nothing unusual. Then, without warning, the screen exploded in movement. 1 dot, then 10, then 100. The entire display flooded with ghostly echoes, hundreds of aircraft signatures suddenly blooming out of nowhere. Emil froze. He wiped the screen, thinking it was dust. He recalibrated the set. The signals only multiplied. "Multiple formations approaching from the west," he shouted. Officers hurried into the room. No one spoke at first. They stared at the impossible radar picture spreading across every sector. It didn't look like a bomber stream. It looked like an armada. Phones started ringing. Other stations were reporting the same thing. Massive clusters of incoming aircraft, far more than anyone believed the British even had. In the command bunker, officers argued over the maps. "This is it. They're coming for Hamburg. They're coming for the whole north." Searchlights swept wildly across the sky, catching nothing. Anti-aircraft guns fired blindly into empty darkness. Night fighter pilots scrambled, only to find themselves chasing illusions. The Kammhuber line, the most sophisticated radar defense system in the world, had gone blind in seconds. What Emil didn't know was that the British bombers overhead were not using any new radar, new aircraft, or secret engine. They were dropping thousands of thin, glittering strips of metal, so light they floated like snowflakes, yet powerful enough to fool every radar in Germany. A weapon nobody took seriously. A weapon scientists had called tinfoil. And on this night, that tinfoil shattered the defenses of a nation. In the year leading up to that night, the British bomber offensive was on the edge of collapse. Every morning, at airfields scattered across England, ground crews waited anxiously as formations limped home, sometimes missing entire squadrons. The losses were brutal. 1 out of every 5 bombers didn't return. Sometimes 1 out of 3. It didn't matter how skilled the pilots were or how tight their formations looked on paper. Once they crossed into the dark airspace of occupied Europe, German night fighter crews were waiting, guided with uncanny precision by a network of radars that saw everything. The RAF called it the Black Corridor, a belt of radar stations stretching from Denmark to France, designed to funnel bomber streams into kill boxes. German controllers watched their screens like chess masters, sending Bf-110 and Ju-88 night fighters to intercept with ruthless efficiency. They didn't need luck. They had technology. They had timing. They had the Kammhuber line. And Britain had losses. In Whitehall, frustration grew. Winston Churchill demanded solutions. Arthur "Bomber" Harris argued that strategic bombing could still cripple Germany, if only his crews could survive long enough. But the math was merciless. At the current rate, Bomber Command was losing men faster than it could train replacements. A few more months of this, and Britain would be forced to scale back the only offensive weapon it had directly striking German industry. Enter R.V. Jones, a thin, sharp-minded scientist in British intelligence whose job was to understand German technology and defeat it. Jones knew the RAF didn't need bigger bombs or faster planes. They needed to blind the radar that guided the night fighters. And somewhere in a dusty wartime folder sat an idea so simple and ridiculous that most officers laughed when they heard it. What if you dropped lightweight strips of aluminum from an aircraft? What if each strip was cut to a precise length, matching the wavelength of German radar? What if thousands of these strips filled the sky at once, creating a cloud of fake echoes so dense that the radar couldn't distinguish real bombers from drifting metal confetti? The concept was called Word, a joke name for a weapon no one believed in. The problem wasn't whether it could work. Jones knew it would. The problem was fear. If Britain used it, Germany could copy it instantly. And if Germany used it first, British radar defenses might collapse just as easily. Civilian cities, ports, even the Royal Navy could be left blind. So the idea sat in a drawer for nearly a year, gathering dust while bombers continued to fall. Window was the weapon everyone needed, and the weapon everyone was terrified to unleash. The strange thing about Window was that it wasn't a British invention at all. Not entirely. In labs across Germany, Luftwaffe scientists had already stumbled upon the exact same idea. They called their version Dupel, bundles of metallic strips cut to radar wavelength, capable of creating false echoes. Their scientists demonstrated it in controlled tests. Their radar screens swarmed with phantom targets, just as Britons would later experience. The effect was undeniable. Dupel worked. But when German officers presented the idea to their superiors, a chilling silence followed. If they used it, the British would copy it. And if British bombers ever dropped Dupel over German cities, the Kammhuber line would collapse. The prized defensive network that Göring boasted was impenetrable would be reduced to a guessing game. So the Germans locked the idea away. And in Britain, almost the exact same conversation unfolded. When R.V. Jones demonstrated Window to RAF leadership, a senior officer stared at the drifting foils and muttered, "If we use this, the Germans will retaliate in kind." The fear wasn't hypothetical. Britain's radar chain, born from the Battle of Britain, was still essential. If German bombers dropped chaff over London, British early warning could be blinded in seconds. So both nations sat on the same weapon, terrified of being the first to deploy it. This bizarre deadlock created a silent, invisible standoff. Scientists on both sides wrote reports urging action. Radar technicians begged for trials, but high command, German and British alike, refused to risk unleashing a genie they couldn't control. Meanwhile, the war outside the laboratories grew uglier. German night fighter tactics improved. Their radar became sharper, their defenses more coordinated, and Bomber Command's losses rose from tragic to unsustainable. Crews whispered about the corridor of death. Rookie pilots entering their first mission were warned not to get attached to their new friends. Still, Window remained locked in a metal cabinet in Whitehall, gathering dust. Dupel remained sealed in Luftwaffe files, never used. It was a stalemate of fear, a race neither side dared start. But fear could not hold forever. Outside the meeting rooms, Britain was losing men faster than it could replace them. And inside the mind of R.V. Jones, one thought grew louder by the week. Not using Window will kill more of us than using it ever could. Both sides knew the trick. Both sides understood the power. But only one nation would be desperate enough to break the silence first. By early 1943, the bomber war had reached a breaking point. Every night, Arthur, Bomber, Harris watched formations take off in majestic rows, hundreds of aircraft roaring into the darkness. And every morning he stood on the tarmac waiting for the survivors to return. He saw the empty spaces where bombers should have been. He saw the ambulances waiting near the control tower. He saw young crews climbing down from shattered aircraft, some bleeding, some silent, some staring into nothing. The numbers were no longer tragic, they were catastrophic. The Kammhuber line, with its radar-guided night fighters, was tearing the RAF apart. Germany wasn't guessing. It wasn't scrambling blindly. It was hunting. And it was winning. Inside Whitehall, tension thickened. Reports from Bomber Command showed that losses were approaching a point where the entire strategy might become impossible to sustain. The RAF could not afford to lose 600 men in a single week. It could not afford to lose veterans faster than they could be replaced by barely trained rookies. Something needed to change. But every time R.V. Jones brought up Window, the same argument echoed across the polished, smoke-filled war rooms. If we use it, Germany will copy it. If they copy it, they will blind us. And every time, Window was pushed aside again. Then the moment came when hesitation was no longer an option. Churchill called for a full assessment of the bombing campaign. The numbers were laid out plainly. Without a breakthrough, the RAF would bleed itself dry before the year was over. Cities like Essen and Hamburg could only be struck at immense cost, while German industry recovered faster than Britain could destroy it. Churchill listened quietly. He puffed his cigar. And then he issued a decision that cut through every layer of military caution. "Use window," he said. "We will take the risk." There was no debate after that. When Churchill spoke in that tone, the room did not argue. The gamble was set. Harris received the order with a mixture of relief and dread. He knew window might save his air crews. He also knew they were about to unleash something that could not be undone. The target chosen for its first use would be Hamburg, an enormous port city whose destruction might cripple German morale and industry, if the bombers could reach it alive. In briefing rooms across England, crews gathered around chalkboards expecting news of new tactics or new defensive measures. Instead, their commanding officers handed each bomber a pile of small paper bundles filled with silver strips. "When you cross the German coast," the officers instructed, "throw these out every minute." The crews stared. Some laughed. Some thought it was a joke. This flimsy, silly material was the great secret Churchill had backed. But as they loaded their bombers and climbed into the night sky, none of them knew they were carrying the most important weapon of the air war. A weapon brilliant in design, ridiculous in appearance, and powerful enough to blind an entire nation. On the night of July 24th, 1943, as the first waves of RAF bombers crossed the dark waters of the North Sea, the crews began doing something that felt almost comical. With one hand on the yoke and the other clutching a paper bundle, they opened small hatches in the fuselage and tossed out fistfuls of window, thin metallic strips that spiraled downward into the night wind. The material glimmered faintly in the moonlight, twisting and tumbling like silver snow. Inside the bombers, men joked about littering the German countryside. Some muttered that if this was the big secret weapon, then the war was truly lost. But far below, in radar stations stretching across northern Germany, the effect was instant and catastrophic. One operator after another stared at glowing screens as they erupted into chaos. Perfectly clean radar tracks suddenly shattered into impossible clusters. Dozens of fake bomber streams appeared where moments earlier the airspace had been empty. Some echoes drifted slowly, some moved erratically, some overlapped in clouds so dense they looked like entire armadas. Controllers tried to adjust their scopes, convinced the equipment had been damaged, but the confusion only intensified. German night fighter pilots scrambled, climbing into a sky where nothing made sense. Their ground controllers shouted conflicting directions. "Turn east! Large formation detected." "No, wait. Ignore that. New contact north." "Stand by. Multiple targets. Everywhere." But the fighters found nothing. Every time they raced toward a contact, it dissolved into thin air. Every vector was wrong. Every radar return was a lie. Back in Hamburg, the city's searchlights swung in wide, frantic arcs, unable to lock onto a single aircraft. Anti-aircraft guns fired blindly at phantom shadows. Entire batteries wasted ammunition on targets that weren't real. And while the German defense system clawed at illusions, the real bomber stream glided through untouched. The RAF Pathfinders arrived first, dropping flares that lit the city like a terrible sunrise. Then came the main force, Lancasters, Halifaxes, and Sterlings, approaching in near total safety. For months they had flown into death traps. Tonight, they flew as if wrapped in invisibility. The first explosions rolled through Hamburg. High-explosive bombs tore open streets and buildings. Moments later, cascades of incendiaries followed, bouncing along rooftops and bursting into white-hot flame. Fires began to spread faster than fire crews could respond. Window kept drifting, cloud after cloud. Each bomber's release created a fresh hole in Germany's radar picture. Each strip ensured another fighter was misdirected. Each bundle bought the bombers more time. By midnight, the Kammhuber line, the pride of the Luftwaffe, was effectively gone. And as Hamburg burned beneath them, British crews realized something extraordinary had happened. For the first time in the war, they had crossed into the heart of Germany, and almost nothing had tried to stop them. The blindness had begun. By dawn, the scale of the disaster was undeniable. Command posts up and down the German coast flooded Berlin with reports that all said the same thing. Radar failures, phantom contacts, scrambled fighters chasing nothing. Technicians were pulled from their beds, ordered to inspect equipment that was functioning perfectly. Officers demanded answers that no one could give. How could every radar station, every fighter controller, every detection system fail on the same night? In the corridors of the Luftwaffe High Command, tensions sharpened into anger. Senior officers blamed the operators. Operators blamed the machines. Technicians blamed the weather. It didn't matter. All of them were wrong. Meanwhile, Window kept drifting. As the next night's RAF raids began, the same pattern repeated. Radar screens detonated with fake signals the moment British bombers crossed the coast. Stations tried filtering the returns, adjusting gains, recalibrating frequencies. Nothing worked. Some scopes showed hundreds of moving targets. Others showed massive, shimmering clouds with no direction or form at all. Controllers issued orders at random, hoping a lucky vector would put a fighter in front of a real bomber. It didn't. Night fighter crews flew in circles, burning precious fuel while listening to panicked voices on the radio. A few pilots, frustrated beyond reason, simply switched off their radar sets and flew visually, an act of desperation that rarely worked and often left them disoriented in the darkness. On the ground, flak gunners depended entirely on radar direction. But with their feeds corrupted, gun batteries blasted the sky blindly, hitting nothing but empty air. Some crews refused to fire at all, terrified they would waste ammunition on illusions while the real bombers passed overhead. Inside Hamburg, a city already wounded from the first raid, fire brigades struggled to navigate streets choked with rubble and flame. The second attack ignited new blazes that merged with those still smoldering from the night before. Entire neighborhoods burned without challenge, because the men meant to protect them were forced to fight chaos instead of enemy aircraft. Only now, after 2 nights of devastation, did Luftwaffe engineers begin to grasp the truth. Someone had attacked the radar itself. Not with bombs, not with jamming, but with physics. With simple, drifting metal strips cut so precisely that every piece became a mirror for their most sensitive equipment. The realization hit like a blow. They had known about this weapon. They had tested it themselves, and they had locked it away out of fear. Now Britain had used it first, and the German air defense network, the system Goering once declared invincible, was collapsing faster than anyone could rebuild it. For the first time in the war, Germany was fighting with its eyes closed. On July 27, 1943, as the sun sank behind the ruins of Hamburg, the city's exhausted residents prayed the worst had already passed. They had spent 2 nights running through smoke-filled streets, pulling neighbors from collapsed shelters, and watching entire blocks burn. Fire brigades were stretched thin. Water lines were broken. Families slept in basements that smelled of ash. No one imagined the next raid would be different, let alone worse. But that night, Window made sure Germany's defenses were blind from the moment the bombers crossed the coast. As the first flares dropped over Hamburg, the city glowed with an unnatural light. Pathfinders marked their targets with eerie precision. The main bomber stream followed minutes later. High-explosive bombs slammed into streets and markets, ripping open buildings and exposing wooden beams that had dried out from 2 nights of heat. Glass shattered. Roof tiles became shrapnel. Explosions rolled across the city in a violent wave. Then came the incendiaries. Tens of thousands of small canisters rained down, bouncing along rooftops like metal hail before bursting into violent white flame. They ignited attics, stairwells, furniture, and clothing in seconds. Fires leapt from house to house with terrifying speed. Light winds strengthened into a steady pull. Flames merged into long ribbons that snaked down the streets. Entire districts ignited almost simultaneously. Window continued to float overhead, glinting faintly in the firelight. To the radar operators outside the city, the screen looked like a blizzard of ghosts. They couldn't tell where the bombers were. They didn't know how many there were. They barely knew anything at all. And without accurate radar guidance, night fighters never reached the bomber stream. Searchlights caught nothing. Anti-aircraft batteries fired at illusions. By midnight, the heat inside Hamburg had grown monstrous. Fires joined together into a single massive inferno, so large it began sucking in air from all directions. Winds roared down the streets at hurricane force, feeding oxygen into the flames. People trying to flee felt themselves pulled backward by a force they couldn't fight. Trees were uprooted. Debris hurled through the air. The temperature soared above 1,000 degrees. The firestorm was born. Inside basements, families suffocated as oxygen vanished. Outside, entire blocks collapsed in cascades of flame. Fire brigades could not get close. The wind knocked men to the ground, tore hoses from their hands, and melted the rubber under their boots. Above it all, the bombers turned for home, their crews staring back at a horizon glowing red like a molten sea. They had just completed the deadliest bombing raid Europe had ever seen, and Germany had never fired a meaningful shot in return. Not because it lacked courage, not because it lacked fighters, but because window had blinded its eyes. When the flames finally died and the smoke began to drift away, Hamburg resembled a city struck by a natural disaster more than a military target. Whole districts were simply gone, reduced to fields of ash, twisted metal, and collapsed brick. Streets had melted into thick tar that hardened into black rivers at dawn. Walking through some neighborhoods, rescue teams found no recognizable buildings at all, only charred outlines where entire families had once lived. The silence was the worst part. No cars, no sirens, only the crackle of cooling ruins. In basements, firefighters discovered victims seated upright, as if asleep. Entire shelters suffocated when the firestorm consumed the oxygen. Others had tried to flee but collapsed only meters from safety, overcome by the searing heat or by the hurricane-force winds that had pulled them back toward the flames. The death toll rose into the tens of thousands, a number so staggering that German officials struggled to comprehend it. But inside the Luftwaffe headquarters, another realization settled in, one almost as devastating. Hamburg hadn't fallen because British bombers were unstoppable. Hamburg hadn't fallen because Germany lacked courage or skill. Hamburg had fallen because a handful of drifting metal strips had turned the nation's most advanced defense system into scrap. Reports poured in from radar stations along the coast. Equipment malfunction. Impossible signals. Targets appearing everywhere. Cannot distinguish real bombers. Technicians insisted the machines were functioning correctly. Operators insisted the readings were impossible. Commanders insisted the defenses were intact. None of them wanted to admit the truth. That the secret weapon they themselves had discovered years earlier, the one they refused to use out of fear, was now being used against them with brutal efficiency. Luftwaffe engineers scrambled for explanations. Some blamed electrical interference. Others blamed British jamming. A few whispered the unthinkable, that the Allies had found a way to exploit the radar system's physics itself. Within days, the truth spread. This was Dupel. This was the weapon Germany had feared to deploy. This was the idea they had buried. And now it was reshaping the air war. Meanwhile, in Britain, the mood was conflicted. Pilots who had expected to die found themselves returning home without a single fighter encounter. Crews who had lost friends on every mission flew through German airspace as if protected by an invisible shield. But when they learned what had happened on the ground in Hamburg, even hardened veterans felt a heavy weight in their chests. This was victory, yes, but it was a victory forged in fire. Germany had been blinded. Hamburg had been broken. And Window, so small, so easily mocked, had proven to be one of the most devastating weapons of the war. In the weeks after Hamburg, the war did not slow down, but something beneath the surface had changed forever. Window, once dismissed as a silly laboratory trick, now sat at the center of a quiet revolution. Its effects rippled outward from the ruins of Hamburg into every radar bunker, every airfield, every war room across Europe. Germany rebuilt its defenses, recalibrated its radars, and revised its fighter tactics. But none of it restored the certainty they once held. Each new raid brought the fear that Window might return. Each radar echo became suspect. Each night fighter scramble felt like a gamble instead of a calculated intercept. The Kammhuber line had been broken, not by force, but by an idea. In Britain, scientists who once argued endlessly over a few grams of aluminum now watched as chaff became standard equipment aboard every bomber. Crews no longer laughed at the bundles they tossed overboard. They understood now. Without Window, many of them would never have made it home. R.V. Jones, quiet, analytical, often underestimated, had changed the course of the air war with a weapon light enough to float on a breeze. And yet, the success carried a shadow. The firestorm of Hamburg haunted many who participated in the raids. They knew Window had saved thousands of Allied airmen, but it had also opened the door for unprecedented destruction on the ground. The line between innovation and devastation had never been thinner. In private memos, some scientists acknowledged the moral weight of what they had helped unleash. In public, they remained silent. War rarely offered simple answers. After 1945, Window did not vanish. It evolved. The Jet Age adopted it. The Cold War perfected it. By the Korean War and Vietnam, chaff was deployed automatically from pods beneath wings. In the Gulf War, entire formations vanished from enemy radar by releasing updated versions of those same drifting strips. Even today, on modern fighter jets and warships, pilots still carry chaff cartridges, ready to confuse missiles that chase radar reflections in the sky. The idea that once terrified two nations into inaction became a cornerstone of electronic warfare. And perhaps that is Window's true legacy. A reminder that the smallest inventions can reshape the largest battles. That war is often decided not by the loudest explosions, but by the quietest insights. That something as delicate as a handful of foil, drifting weightlessly in the night air, can blind an empire and alter the fate of thousands. Window was simple. Window was mocked. Window was feared. And in the end, it changed the war. In 1943, the Allies launched one of the most daring and absurd-sounding operations of World War II. Tomorrow, dropping millions of tiny strips of metal from bomber aircraft. It sounded ridiculous. It looked harmless. Many commanders mocked it as nothing more than tinfoil. Yet this simple idea, later called Window, shattered Nazi radar, blinded Germany's most advanced air defense network, and helped save thousands of Allied airmen. When the British finally unleashed it over Hamburg, German operators watched their radar screens explode with phantom aircraft. Night fighters scrambled to chase ghosts, anti-aircraft guns fired into empty sky, and a single weapon, lighter than a feather, changed the air war forever.